So, I learned something about myself several months ago that I didn't necessarily want to know at the time. And just let me preface the rest of this by saying that I'm not a vegetarian. So, this happened in an English class in which we were talking about the ethics of eating animals. I heard 5 or 6 arguments against eating meat and a few responses to those arguments, and I wound up agreeing that the arguments against eating meat held more weight to them. They made more sense to me. They were more logically straightforward. It wasn't that I thought eating meat was objectively wrong, but it was at the very least a bit hard for me to justify. And what I learned about myself was that I didn't really care about the question at hand. I decided that the arguments against it probably made more sense, went to Pereski, got some flank steak for dinner, and I didn't think twice about it. Now, I'm not saying that with a sense of remorse either. I don't intend to stop eating meat anytime in the near future, and really I take no moral issue with it. But I do think the experience let me understand myself a little better. I want to make explicit that I don't see myself to be an apathetic person. But nonetheless, here I was, choosing to do what I thought may very well be wrong. It isn't that I saw something truly wrong with the world and was actively choosing not to do something about it. What I saw is something that I could rationalize to be wrong and still not feel it to be. And that caught my eye, because it's something that I wasn't completely comfortable with. I'm a math major. I like logical validity. I like if-then. So I felt a little uneasy with the idea that what I think I should value may not always line up with how I choose to act. One of the more prevalent conversation topics in my life at the moment is the situation in Ukraine. I've had a few friends walk up to me and ask, well, Yasick, what do you think? You know, more often than not, I look at them a little sheepishly and I say, yeah, it's interesting. The rest of what I'm going to say is essentially my attempt to justify that answer and explain why I consider it to be, in fact, a sufficient answer. I was born in the east of Ukraine to a Russian-Ukrainian family, and I still have some family there that I stay in touch with, but to be frank, I'm just as far removed from whatever's going on there as anybody. So I like to vainly believe that that makes it easier for me to stay objective. The protests in Ukraine were, more than anything else, a result of changes in collective ideology. They started because people were unhappy with the president's choice to forego a trade deal with the European Union, but that's not what they were about. Evolution is this process that increases complexity as time goes on, but this was just the opposite of that. Because when the government acted to break up the first wave of protests in their own way, the motivations got simpler. So all of a sudden, these protests, they weren't about the state of Ukrainian trade policy, they were a public challenge to a democracy that didn't feel like one to the people that it served. There's a moral understanding that when a government serves its people, it doesn't necessarily matter what's best for the country when the government oversteps its bounds. And that was accomplished through the use of force to promote a peace that people didn't want. People protested, more than anything else, how the government responded to them. One thing I want to get across is that Ukraine is not like a Western country. It sounds so obvious, but I want to try my best to explain that it's a difference that doesn't just apply to how people live. Even within Ukraine, between the East and the West, it applies to how people think. And along with that come very different understandings of what a national government is for. In Ukraine, the ideological shift towards Western values of self-leadership is more recent than people like to give it credit for. Throughout most of its past, Ukraine has been part of a Russian empire, and an idea historically inherent to the Russian political mentality is that in a country with so much land and so few means of watching over all of it, a democracy would fall apart. When Ukraine gained its independence in 1991, it didn't know how to govern itself. It had just missed out on 70 years' worth of practice. So in many ways, the old tradition stayed. Now it's a different story. The newer, younger generation has a harder time accepting things as they were before Ukraine's independence. So the protests were fundamentally a check on the duties of government relative to the roles of citizens. There's a clear separation between East and West within Ukraine. Most of the nationalist sentiment is in the West, but the East is full of ethnic Russians. And that divide is uncomfortably clear-cut. When the economy needs help, the eastern half of the country looks to Russia, to the hand that feeds, to the successes of history. Western Ukraine looks towards Europe, towards the United States, not necessarily for help, but at least for an idea on how to help themselves. But here, the whole country stood up for rights that we take for granted. And for me, it was a gratifying thing to watch. Because the divide in Ukraine, it's not just East and West, it's also between the old and the new. There are those who know Ukraine to be nothing more than a Russian satellite, and there are those who want some closure to their break from the Soviet Union. And it was a cause that really commanded my respect. It was people fighting for their own independence. And that's the theme that stuck when the attention shifted to the Russians seeing the opportunity to reaffirm their presence on the Black Sea and invade Crimea. This talk is about social justice. But my question is, justice for whom? Within Ukraine, you have people who are willing to fight for their independence. And you have people who don't think that it's worth losing their ties to Russia. Russia is their quality of life, their language, and frankly, their culture. How do you consolidate justice to encompass two irreconcilable objectives, both of which feel right? Ukraine's conflict is one of two opposing paradigms, two very different understandings of what is best for the people. And that very idea, the people, raises yet another question. How does the people subdivide the population? If it's talking about the entire geographic population of the country, it may very well be the case that there's no way to tell which outcome is the most just. Because there are different groups who want different things for what are to them the right reasons. Look, there are things we know to be right. They may not be absolute, but there are at the very least things we feel to be right. There are things we know to be wrong. I may be naive in saying it, but I like to think that I know what those things are when they come my way. It's the shades of gray that matter. I know freedom to be an inalienable human right. I know that national independence is a worthy pursuit, but the situation in Ukraine challenges the objectivity of that in a way that I don't know yet how to confront. It's hard to have it both ways. I can't say that Russia was wrong to invade Crimea and then say that the ousting of the president by the people was right. The reason I say that, first and foremost, is because history's shown us that the former Soviet republics have a truly phenomenal track record of filling power vacuums with profoundly unpopular leadership. And what if, hypothetically, the majority of ethnic Russians in Crimea were to want to strengthen their ties with Russia? Would whatever government we'll see in power in Ukraine in the near future let them? And if they didn't, would it not break the very same principles that make me uncomfortable with Russia's invasion of Crimea? It may be that justice has two sides to it. One idealistic and one closer to a real-world practical standpoint. Russia is Ukraine's most important trade partner. So does quality of life fall into my understanding of justice? how much are the individual factors worth? You can't do calculus with ethics, but I guess that's the very crux of the problem. I wouldn't be so quick to label the good guys and the bad guys, because the next cliche but relevant question is, do the ends justify the means? Now, I'm not in any way justifying an armed invasion, but what if you take the actors and the methods out of the equation? Is justice the same when it only applies to an end, to the net effect an action has on people's lives? It's evident that we live in a connected world. How do you try and balance the interests of citizens with the messages you send the rest of the world? Even if we imagine that the annexation of Crimea is quote-unquote for the greater good, we run the risk of a moral hazard. We tell the world that unless national boundaries can be enforced, national sovereignty is a work of fiction. The message we send regarding what is the just approach to resolving a conflict of citizens' interests and national interests, that concerns the world at large. So let's step back from the situation in Ukraine. It's one of the more recent and relevant examples of what can happen in circumstances where the right outcome may not be clear, but on a smaller scale, I think it's a question that we all often face. My point, it's not about action. It's about understanding where you stand and why. And frankly, I couldn't even tell you which is the more important of the two. Without action, you're acting to strengthen the status quo. It's an obvious point that without action, nothing happens. And I'm not trying to put action on the back burner. I don't urge anything more than a little bit of caution. And if that caution stops you from knowing anything beyond it's interesting, that's all right. Thank you.